Hello and good morning. Welcome to another edition of Shree's Sunday New York Times Read-Along. We're celebrating 5 years of the Read-Along, and our guest this week is Neil Genzlinger, New York Times obituary writer, previously a New York Times theater and TV critic, and a Rett Syndrome parent. Neil was actually on the show 4 years ago in September. So we will look forward to catching up with him and hearing about his work on the Obits desk. At the top of the show, Dan Barry will be joining us. He's a New York Times columnist. He'll be paying tribute to fellow columnist Jim Dwyer, who passed away this week. Sri Srinivasan, of course, is our host. He's the Marshall Loeb Professor at the Stony Brook School of Journalism and co-founder of Digimentors, a digital and virtual events consultancy. My name is Neil Parekh. I'm the executive producer and guest host of the New York Times Read-Along and vice president of events and communications at Digimentors. We'll go ahead and get started with our traditional Upper West Side cam to check in with Shri. With that, Shri, what are you seeing out there? It looks pretty good.
Good morning. It's a beautiful day in October. And thank you, Neil, for all you do for bringing us this wonderful show every single week. We are on the Upper West Side looking from our apartments out onto Midtown in the distance. This is the Upper West Side of Manhattan. There's Midtown. That's about 57th Street, where you see the really skinny, really ugly, tall buildings. And then beyond it is you can see a little bit of the Chrysler, and all the way at the end, you see the successor to the World Trade Center. And I'm thinking of it today because we'll be talking about Jim Dwyer, who passed away. And Jim did some incredible reporting and writing about the 9/11 attacks, including a series called 102 Minutes. And here you see the Hudson River in New Jersey. And just a beautiful day. And out here you see Central Park in the distance right over there. And you can see it's pretty quiet. Sunday mornings are quiet in New York, but since the pandemic, they've been extra quiet. You can also see there's a building coming across the street here, so it's actually not quiet on weekdays because even on my Zoom calls, you can hear the construction that is taking place over there.
Shri, we have people checking in already. Patricia Freudenberg saying good morning from New York and happy anniversary. Jonathan Borstein saying hello from the East Village. And, of course, my mom. Hi, Mom. Watching from Hastings-on-Hudson, where I grew up. One of our early risers, Doug Levy. Good morning from California. And he's commenting on Jim's death. He's not only a great writer, but also proof of how much impact good journalism can have on a neighborhood. And just in terms of making sure we're staying true to facts, of course, Jim passed away at the age of 63, not 65 as we had on the card. But thank you for the correction. Neil Genzlinger, one of our main guests this morning, pointed that out. We have... who else do we have joining us? Diane Stefani from Margate, New Jersey, and somewhere over there where everything's legal, right, Shri?
Yeah, that's what Hamilton taught us. Everything's legal in New Jersey.
Sujana Chandrasekhar saying good morning. Great apple picking weekend. Laura Silverman from watching from LinkedIn this week, saying hello from Philadelphia. Rusadon saying good morning from Yonkers, just next door to Hastings, where my mom is. And Linda Lawrence is saying hi from Long Island. And, of course, Mark Oppenheim from good morning from Wantagh, New Jersey. Mark led a great workshop recently, a jobs workshop. He leads MEO Jobs and has done great work sharing leads for folks in the media and entertainment industries. We also have Bill Mitchell joining us from Boston. Shri.
Oh, hi, Bill. Bill, terrific journalist and editor, was my editor at Pointer when I worked for Pointer.org as a columnist. Fantastic editor. Thanks, Bill, for being here. And I just want to say to Sujana, Dr. Chandrasekhar is getting ready for her show, She's on Call, which will run at 11 a.m. Eastern. So that's a great show. Everyone should watch that. Two surgeons talking about COVID and so much more.
Absolutely. She's on Call will be on at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, just after our New York Times read-along. She and Dr. Marina Kurian are the hosts of that show. Shri plays my role as one of the executive producers, and it's a great show. Our other Digimentors teammates, Rose Horowitz, Vandana Menon, and Julia Weeks, help put that show together every week for Dr. Chandrasekhar and Dr. Kurian. And there's Shri.
Morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. So delighted to have all of you here. 5 years, Neil. I can't believe we've been doing this for 5 years. You joined about 3 years ago, but you took what was just a fun way for me to test Facebook and to pay tribute to the print edition of the Times, and you've made it into something really special, a community of thousands of people who watch every single week, and we get these amazing guests. And so let's get started.
Absolutely. So good morning, Francesca, watching from Ardsley, another Westchester viewer. So I think Westchester's in the house today. Before we start, I appreciate the shout out, Shri, but we couldn't do this without our team. Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, Julia Weeks, and Carla Baranakis. One of the things that is special about the work that we do with the New York Times read-along is that we, in addition to showing the paper and having great guests, we also have people who are watching in Facebook and LinkedIn, etc., actively engaging with the audience. So without Paula, Steve, Julia, and Carla, the experience would be completely different. What they're doing is putting in links to articles that we're talking about, engaging with people. So many brands just put up a live stream, point a camera at an event, and then walk away. So thank you again, Paula, Steve, Julia, and Carla, for all the great work you do. And Carla in particular has done incredible work working with us to bring some great guests to the show. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into our show. We'll thank our sponsors in just a bit. But Shri, what I'd like to do first, as we bring you back on with the paper, we'd like to take a moment to recognize Jim Dwyer. And to do that, we have Dan Barry who's joining us. So Dan, we're going to bring Dan Barry onto the screen, the scene, and I'll let you take it from here, Shri. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's see here. Can you hear me, Dan?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Dan, thank you for being here. I'm a great admirer of yours. You're an amazing columnist, a writer. Your book in 2018 was named one of the best books of 2018 by the Chicago Tribune. And I'm so glad that you're with us. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. You're on my wish list of people from the New York Times to have on the read-along. And I'm sorry that it's because we're talking about Jim that we have you here. So I hope you'll come back another day when we can talk about your work. Let's start with the story of Jim, a journalist who I first got to know because of his work at Newsday. And he won a Pulitzer Prize in '95 for his work in '94 and earlier. And then he joined the New York Times. And he passed away this week at the age of 63. I advanced his age to 65 in the promo card, so I'm sure Jim would be amused by that I added 2 years there in a simple error but a big mistake on that. He would have not been happy. I got to meet him, Dan, when because he's a fellow alum of Columbia Journalism School, so we would run into events and things over the years in New York. The media scene is big, but not that big, as you know.
Right. Well, I wish he had 2 more years, actually. I wish the typo were true, and certainly more than that. he was a stellar journalist, and journalists often say that about one another. But what distinguished Jim was first his sense of righteousness, and secondly, what a decent, good man he was. And if you were to go to the New York Times Metropolitan newsroom today, if we were allowed back in, you would hear a series of testimonies from younger reporters, including reporters who have only been there a couple of years, and they would speak about how Jim had been supportive of them and had encouraged them, and would take note of even the smallest stories that they might have written for the Times. And that's just one little hint of what kind of guy Dwyer was.
And he had a lot of impact in his reporting and writing, made a difference and had an impact. Let's talk a little bit about that. You can see here the headline in the New York Times obit. Jim Dwyer, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, dies at 63, working for New York Newsday, the Daily News, and the Times. He covered the human stories of New York in dramatic prose and crusaded against injustice.
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly. He directed. He often directed his great talents and his really sharp Jesuitical intellect to stories of injustice, and giving voice to the voiceless and the vulnerable. And those who read the wonderful Obituary by Bob McFadden will see that Jim came by it honestly in a way. His parents were both born in Ireland. They were working class. They raised a family in a small apartment on the Upper East Side, the Upper East Side. And Jim understood what it was like to struggle and to work hard. And so that informed his journalism. You know, his mother was a nurse at Bellevue. His father was a custodian in a school. And I think Jim, it's a great credit among the Irish to say that you never forgot where you came from. And that was Jim. And so if you go and look at his work over the course of 4 decades, one common theme is this sense of pursuit of justice, and also the injustices that have been leveled against working class, people of color, the invisible, the quote unquote invisible among us. And that's really where his truest strength lay. So there are many, many examples of championing people, for example, Black teenagers who were being racially profiled by New Jersey state troopers, or writing about the Central Park Five. And in fact, Jim thought often about how he had covered it initially and had the courage and the integrity to say maybe he got some of that wrong in his initial reporting. He also championed awareness of sepsis, because the child of a friend of his had died of sepsis at the age of 12. A little nick on the arm, and it developed into something worse. And Jim used his platform to heighten awareness about sepsis. There are myriad examples, but that's who Jim was, sure.
And it's fascinating to just kind of look through the stories here as Neil's sharing this right now. I'm just looking at all the range was also quite stunning.
Right. Some people, some of us listening here may think, oh, Jim Dwyer just came fully formed to the New York Times in about 2001. He had an unbelievable career, 20 years for the 20 years preceding that. First at some small newspapers in New Jersey, and then coming to the Daily News, and then for New York Newsday. He won a Pulitzer in 1994 with some really wonderful, wonderful columns. So he had an extensive, admirable journalistic track record before he came to the Times. And then he arrived at the Times in, I think, around May or so of 2001. And, as we all know, 4 months later, 9/11 happened. And it's fitting, in retrospect, for me, I can tell you how I met him and got to know him. But on 9/11, I was, I live in New Jersey, and I had to rush to get into the city when everyone else was rushing out. And I somehow made it down to Weehawken and got on the Circle Line, which was ferrying people across Manhattan to New Jersey. And so hundreds of people on the ferry going to Weehawken, and then no one is on the ferry going back. When I went, it was me and 4 or 5 other people. And when we finally reached the other side, the Manhattan side around 43rd Street, there's a swarm of people trying to get back on the circle, to get on the Circle Line. And I made my way through that crowd. And literally the first person I saw when I touched Manhattan ground was Jim Dwyer. And we just looked at each other, stunned, sort of spoke for a few minutes, and then went on our paths to cover what had happened. And Jim, his work on 9/11 is distinguished, and I think a lot of people remember him for that, not only for the book he wrote with Kevin Flynn called 102 Minutes, which really is kind of the definitive book about exactly what happened and why. But he also wrote these wonderful profiles, including one about a squeegee man who was in an elevator with several other guys, and it was stuck in one of the towers after one of the hits, and how the squeegee man and the other people on the elevator used it to carve through the wall effectively to get themselves freed, and they barely made it. But the way Jim tells it is extraordinary, and I think that squeegee handle was given to the Smithsonian at one point.
Wow, I'm just thinking about 9/11 again on this day. And by the way, I was showing you earlier, if you remember the sky of New York City, I was showing you what that looked like. And my wife and I use this term 9/11 blue, when it's that specific shade of blue. And we think about, so today it's not 9/11 blue, but it's that same crisp weather. And he really, that 102 minutes, I recommend everyone get the book. If you can't get the book, if the original in-depth story that was in the Times is also worth reading as a great introduction. Especially, we have so many people who, for 9/11, it was 20 years ago. It was a long time ago for them, and they may not know everything that happened. So do check that out, just the story or the book itself. And I think we have a picture of the squeegee tool that was used. We saw that in the obit as well. Tell us how you met Jim Dwyer.
Well, like any journalist trying to get better, you read the best. And so I would read Jim. I used to work in New England, and I'm from New York, and I would read his stuff. And then when I came to the Times, oftentimes he and I were writing about the same issues. And so I finally met him in 2000. We were in the press pen, if you can imagine this, at St. Patrick's Cathedral for the funeral of Cardinal John O'Connor, which was a huge event in Roman Catholicism, but also in New York City. And so we were penned in almost like at a press event. And the procession into the cavernous cathedral of these clerics from all around the world, marching, strolling up the aisle, seemed to take forever. And they were almost all men. And Dwyer turned to me and he said, "You know what? They all look like Brian Dennehy, the actor." And I remember laughing because it was such an apt moment to talk about how all these guys look like, large Irishmen from central casting, which and the procession lasted. I think it's still going on, actually. But
just reading some of the comments here. Renee Edelman says, "Hi, Sri. It's an honor to watch you interview Dan Barry of the New York Times. I was a classmate of Jim at Columbia Journalism, class of 1980. And thank you, Renee, for checking in. And I'm sure your classmates would want to watch this interview later and to hear us talking about Jim. As I mentioned, I went to J School many years later, but because I was a faculty member there for 20 years, I got to run into Jim and just see his influence. Our students loved reading his work. And this Thursday, we found out 2 hours before my class at Stony Brook that he had died. And our students, they're all undergraduates, hadn't read a lot of Jim's work or weren't familiar with him. But I pulled out several of the stories from the Times as well as from the Obit that the Times from the Pulitzer Prize citation, the 8 or 10 stories, and we read them out loud. I made the students read several paragraphs at a time, and we were all moved by the quality of the writing. And the students remarked that how did he get to say what he felt? Because they're taught, as you know, in journalism, especially in journalism school, that you want to just stick to the facts, no opinion, voice from nowhere, all of those things. And I said, well, he earned it, right? He earned the right to be a columnist. You've got to do a lot of reporting and be a great reporter in order to be a great columnist. Can you talk about that a little bit and how Jim was able to use that voice? You said use the platform and make a difference.
Sure. So for the New York Times cognoscenti, the way that the Times tries to signal, at least in the print version, how a piece is straight news and how a piece is analysis or has voice, or is opinion, is something called ragged right. And it's so, to me, it's so obscure. If I try to explain it to someone who's not, working at the New York Times, they would never notice it. But if you looked at any column by Jim or by me or anyone else in the news columns, the ragged right means that it's not a perfect column of print, of type. It's kind of ragged. Jim, and you're exactly right, Sri. He came by it honestly. So before Jim became a columnist, he had worked for years and years. He worked at the Hudson Dispatch. He worked at the Elizabeth Journal. He worked at the Bergen Record. He worked at the Daily News doing tough, hard-nosed journalism. And what happens is editors see someone who has earned a voice, who has a way of seeing things and expressing them in a singular, distinguishable way. And that marked Jim's career forever. And so once he was given that privilege, and it really is a privilege to be given a column at a newspaper, I would say he milked it for all it was worth. It didn't mean that he could just riff. Okay, so the difference between a news column and say a column on the op-ed section or elsewhere is that in the news column, it's reported out. Okay, so in the finest traditions of people like Jimmy Breslin and others, as someone once said of Breslin, you may have not liked Breslin's writing or his opinion, but he showed up. Okay, he showed up. He would go to that tenement in the Bronx. He would go out to Brooklyn and Queens and take the subway and listen. And Dwyer absolutely did that. And so he's reporting the issues out, whether it's some injustice or some curious moment in the tragic comedy of New York, and then he would convey it so that you knew that what he was saying was true, and here's what Jim Dwyer thought about it. And what would happen is you trusted him because he was right. So if he's telling you about a man wrongfully accused and convicted and serving 13 years in prison, it didn't come off as him popping off some, liberal propaganda or what have you. It was sound. It was as concrete as the pavement of Manhattan.
Thank you. Before I let you go, I want to do two things. I want to show an example of that right. I just learned this while you were talking. I was looking at that, so we're going to show that in a second. But the other is talk about his Irish roots, how you bonded over that, because I'm sure you mentioned it again, not just at that connection you had with at the funeral of the Cardinal.
Yeah. As the years went by, I think that Carla and others would attest. If you were to go into the cafeteria in the New York Times building, both on 43rd Street and then where it is now on 8th Avenue, oftentimes you just see Dwyer and me in the corner, and we would just be talking. We were like we became, it was kind of, it snuck up on us. Suddenly we're the veterans. Suddenly we're the old guys. The younger people saying, "You wrote something in 1998? I wasn't even born yet." That's a great feeling. But Jim and I would sit there, and I would approach him, or he would approach me, and it would always begin the same way. James, and he would say Daniel, and then we would sit and talk. A lot of what we talked about, quite frankly, was in fact Ireland. My mother was from County Galway. His parents were from Galway and Kerry, and it's interesting to think about. As I said earlier, those roots, those working class roots, the immigrant roots, really kind of informed how we saw the world. And also, you remarked on his writing. I do, before I go, I want to point out that though he was Irish American, he was not florid in his writing style. If you go back and read the columns, he is very, very exacting in his words. Every word matters. Okay, he was not one for sentiment. And it struck me, he was a huge fan of the Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, very much so. And going back and reading his stuff over the last few days, as I have, you could see that every word mattered. Every word mattered. And oftentimes he turned prose into poetry.
Beautiful. Thank you. Let's look at some of the comments, and then we will let you go.
Sure.
There's some beautiful comments. Zari says, "Honor to watch this interview." And she says, "We have a hands-on manner to engage our audience and participants." Irish Business New York, "Enjoyed Dan's tweet and photo of him and Jim wearing the same cheap ties bought at Shannon Airport." Let's show that photo again. I know that people would like to see that. And so this was a coincidence, or you guys planned it?
Absolute coincidence. And it's one of these ties that when you're at Shannon Airport in the duty-free shop, the ties are wrapped in plastic, so they're of fine quality. And so, we were both honoring, our heritage and our parents and Ireland. And I was walking past his desk, and we're wearing the same tie, and it was a moment.
What I can't actually see close enough on the tie. What does it say? Is
it and it might be a reverse pattern in the ties, but it's basically kind of a Celtic design. That's
nice.
That's what it is.
Nice, beautiful. All right, let's look at some more comments. I see Ashok says, "Great interview." Kavita saying, "Good morning." Miriam says, "Very interesting." Nicole Nerulius Gupta is watching from New Delhi, fellow Columbia Journalism School grad. And there's so many other comments coming in here. Thank you all for watching. Please share this. And Jim and Neil's mom, Neil Parekh's mom, Sudha, says, "Jim Dwyer's life and work is very interesting." Thank you, Dan.
And Shri, I am jumping in. I want to just share one comment, if I may, from our friend Lori White from Providence. Dan, Lori is a close friend of ours, and we've done a lot of work with her. And we've been helping with the Jim Tarikani lecture series at University of Rhode Island. Lori shared with us that you led the honor guard at Jim Tarikani's funeral. So she wanted to give a special thank you for that, and that you were close to the family. So I wanted to make sure that we got that in there as well.
Thank you.
What a small world, as I said. And Lori,
Jim Tarikani was the guy in Providence, or recovering organized crime and other ne'er-do-wells in Rhode Island life. He was a great guy.
And Lori was a guest on the New York Times read-along a couple of weeks ago, and we are going to pay tribute to Jim Tarikani. The Tarikani lectures a week after, the Tuesday after the elections. As I've taken to saying, if there is a Tuesday after the elections, God knows what's going to happen. But if there is a Tuesday and the internet's working and we're all still here, we will be paying tribute to Jim Tarikani, Lori White Tarikani's former late husband, and we'll be talking to him talking about him during that show. So thank you very much.
She might be giving you a call, Dan, just as a heads up.
Okay.
Before we leave, tell us a story about this picture right here.
Sure. First, notice the photo credit. That is David Dunlap, much beloved Times journalist for many years. A dear, wonderful man. Anytime I had a question about New York architecture or the history of New York, David Dunlap would be the first person I go, and he was very close to Jim as well. David and I sat near each other in the old building, and then later on, David sat near Jim. And so this is, I think, from 2007, and David, of course, chronicled the history of the New York Times from the moment he joined the building, joined the newspaper. And everyone else is clearing out their desks, leaving this historic building filled with ghosts and memories. And David lingered to watch as people left. And here, Jim has now just packed up his desk. And I guarantee that in that wheeled suitcase are little histories of New York, probably some books of poetry, something about perhaps the Innocence Project, which is about dedicated to the wrongfully accused and convicted. It's a great photo. So there's Jim Dwyer, the great Jim Dwyer, leaving the historic Times building. And in a couple of days, he would have his desk in the new building across from the Port Authority on 8th Avenue.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you again, Dan. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Before you go, Dan, one last thing. You taught me something today. You said that columnists in the news section, as opposed to in the Sunday Review, their columns are right ragged instead of being justified, as like in the words, like in Microsoft Word, this would be justified, and then this is left justified, right? And therefore right ragged.
Right, the term of art in journalism, and it's going to go away, like so many other things, but it would be called Ragged Right. It'd be a name of a good band, right? Ragged Right.
It could be the name of what's happening in this country. Tell me about. So, do they do this on? Do the columns online? I'm obviously not looking at the.
I honestly don't. I honestly don't know. It never occurred to me to see when my columns would appear, whether they were Ragged Right online. I don't know.
So here's the justified again for those of you confused about what we're talking about. If it's a regular news article, they justify the print, and if it's a reported column like David Sanger, it's this way. And by the way, here's another great Irish American journalist watching, Kevin McKenna.
Oh, Kevin McKenna, it's great, lovely.
Kevin is a dear friend, and Kevin was one of the first New York Times folks to be on the New York Times read-along, deputy business editor of the New York Times. And it's great to have you here, Kevin. We're talking about Jim Dwyer with Dan Barry. I think it's the Irish trifecta right there.
So Kevin would know better than I about all these ins and outs, all these little curios about how the New York Times presents its news, at least in print. But also you'll see that there was what they call there's also another indicator for the reader. In that piece that you just showed, it was written by David Sanger, who's not, so David Sanger is a brilliant reporter. He's not a columnist, but his depth of knowledge about national security and other matters is so deep that he will then step aside and provide an analysis that this is what's going on. Look at it this way. And it's reported out, but it may have some subjectivity, okay? And so that's why there's the Ragged Right, and that's why it says news analysis to signal that this is a step back from the daily report.
Here you can see that again. I can understand the use of the news analysis because that's helpful. But any reader who would notice this would have to be someone who
No.
is paying a lot of attention. And look at this, Wayne Camadoy, one of your wonderful designers at the Times, says Dan Barry talking about Ragged Right is amazing. Outstanding interview about the great Jim Dwyer.
Wayne's great. Wayne's working on a project with me right now. So
awesome. All right, we'll let you get back to your Sunday. What do you have on tap?
I'm going to read the New York Times. That's what I'm going to do. But I'm also going to read it in print. I get it in print.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you being here, Dan, and for talking. And look at that. Nicole says, I'm a lifelong reader, never noticed the Ragged Right. And so many people saying thank you to you, Dan, for being here. Thank you for being here. I hope you'll come back and read the whole paper with us one day.
I'd be honored. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And that's the great Dan Barry talking about the great Jim Dwyer. Actually, I was hoping to bring Dan back for a second so we can transition to Neil Genzlinger and have
Sure.
Neil and Dan together. Hi, Neil.
Hey, how are you?
Thank you. You just got to listen to our conversation. Your thoughts on Jim?
Someone whose career any other journalist would be envious of. Just a fabulous career. And boy, talking about Rag Right put me back to my early days on the national desk. I started at the Times as a copy editor on the national desk, and late at night we would often be proofing, reading down our pages, and somebody would say, should this Johnny Apple piece be Rag Right? Because he would so often tread the line between news and opinion, and yeah, Rag Right.
And what was the term of art? Q-head? They would call it Q-head.
The dreaded Q-head, the hardest head to write in the newspaper, and the pieces that got a Q-head would get considerable scrutiny from the masthead because they were usually fairly important pieces, and
right.
If you were the guy trying to write that headline, as I sometimes was, and trying to please everybody. Always disliked having to write those Q-head headlines.
Well, we'll let Dan go, and thank you very much, Dan. We'll see you again, and good luck with all your writing.
All right. Thank you for all the time given to Jim. Take care.
And we're going to now transition to talking to Neil Genzlinger about his work, his storied career at the New York Times, former TV critic, theater critic, and now Obits writer at the Times. He was a guest of ours on this show 4 years ago, where we read and talked about the paper. Today, he's in a different spot, and we're just very grateful that he's able to be with us again. And hello, Neil.
Hi. Nice to see you again, virtually. Lot has happened since the last time we chatted, both personally and internationally. Here I am talking to you from Louisiana. I'm visiting my daughter here. As you can see, her hurricane-ravaged backyard back there.
How is everybody?
Everybody's fine. We were not in the hurricane zone. We were in the couple hours of heavy rain zone. So today it's bright and sunny.
Well, we're glad everybody's okay. I believe this is the 5th named storm to hit Louisiana this year. Some stat like that, the most in history.
I moved my daughter in here in the end of May, and this is now the 3rd hurricane scare she's had, and that was in the 4 months she's lived here.
That is, and that is not usual, and that's not normal for even Louisiana, which of course famously hit by hurricanes. Many comments and questions coming in, Neil. But first, we should start with the pronunciation of your name. The way I learned it is, it's like. It's a great way to remember. It's like a gunslinger from the Old West.
Yes, and that's what I always tell people. And if I have to put it across quickly, I just say it's like gunslinger with an E instead of the U. I don't bring up the Z instead of the S because that gets too complicated.
And look at this lovely comment. Gail says, "Nice to see you, Neil. I'm your lifelong fan."
Oh, that's one of my high school classmates. Talking from, you're in the Carolinas somewhere, if I'm remembering where she lives now.
Kavita saying good morning, Neil. And we have greetings from all over the world. Folks, please share this. We're about to read the New York Times with New York Times Obits writer and former theater and TV critic Neil Genzlinger. So tag your friends. They can watch now or later. And Nicole's got a question for an obit writer. So let's go with that. Always curious how it feels for an obit writer to file a piece about a public figure who's still alive, then see that piece run so many years later. And I know, Neil, that you've not been doing this that long, so I don't know if that's happened yet.
Yeah, it has. And before I joined the obit desk, I had written a few advance obits, as we call them, that have started to run. I've got a bunch of them that I've written that have not yet run, and it's the startling part is when they sit in the can for a long time, you often have to get called in the middle of the night to update them when the person actually passes away. One of my earliest memories at the Times, when I was on the culture desk, and I was again a copy editor at that point. The culture desk used to have one copy editor who was scheduled to stay until midnight, even though the rest of the desk went home about 7. One copy editor was scheduled to work until midnight for the sole purpose of being there in case an important cultural figure died. And one night I was that person, and one night the actor from Star Wars, whose name is escaping me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, died. Thank you. On my watch, and I had to pull out the advance obit, and it had been written so long ago that the lead was something like, and he was scheduled to be in a new movie called Star Wars, and so it was written before he was known for that particular role, and I had to do some quick updating on that myself on the fly. So,
well, that tells you something about Alec Guinness, right? That he was famous enough to merit a New York Times obit in 1977 or whenever that was, right? So
right.
that tells you that the Times isn't just writing about famous kind of Hollywood pop culture folks, but people who've had serious careers, and I think that's a tribute to Alec Guinness that they'd done that, and then you had to update it, I guess, in a couple of hours or so.
Yeah, and I always admire those kind of cultural figures who aren't just one-shot actors or actresses or singers or whatever they are, but whose work appealed across generations and across 50 years. They were doing important work in their 20s, and they were still doing important work in their 70s.
Chris Clark says, "Great to see you, Neil, looking in from Tempe, Arizona." And
hi, Christopher.
I have thought that the art of obit writing turns on what the writer omits.
Interesting thought. Certainly, when I write an obit, some of the most interesting stuff doesn't get in to me. And to me, the most interesting part of any obituary is not, say, reciting the list of movies that an actor was in. To me, that it's always going back and not covering their time of being famous, but how did that person get to that point where they could become famous? So I always look at early in the career, or that pivotal moment in school when they took a theater class just to fill out their schedule or whatever. Like there was a mention of Brian Dennehy earlier, whose obituary I wrote. He died earlier this year, I think. And he was a guy like that. His first mentions in the New York Times, if you search in our database, are actually as a football player on the Columbia football team. We had was a big headline when he left the team and left school because he was one of the team captains, and eventually found his way into his acting career. But to me, that's the most interesting part of that of an obit is it's not reciting all the movies and plays he was in. It's what's the serendipity that made him an actor, or what's the pivotal guiding mentor who got him to where he became someone I was writing an obituary about.
We for those of you who missed it, I hope you'll go back and watch the recording of this, which will play on all these channels as soon as we're done. We met Dan Barry, fellow New York Times journalist. He was talking about the passing of Jim Dwyer, and they had met. Jim and Dan had met at the funeral of Cardinal O'Connor, and at that, Jim made a crack about how a lot of the people in the audience looked like Brian Dennehy because of the Irish connection, and both Dan and Jim are Irish, and so all of that ties together. And you mentioned the Columbia football team, and Jim Dwyer went to Columbia, so that's so many ties. The world is small, as we keep pointing out. Let's keep going with some of the comments that have come in also, and here's your collection of your articles. I think the Times does a really good job of highlighting their writers' work. You've got this one-stop shop where you can see your latest, you can search, and you can find various. So your latest obit was just 2 days ago, Those We've Lost. So there's not a full obit. Those We've Lost is about people of significance who died out of the pandemic, right? During the pandemic.
Yeah, and Maurice Edwards actually ended up being a full-length obituary, but he was also happened to be a COVID death. But yeah, Those We've Lost has proven to be which is our pandemic version of the feature that Carla was involved with after 9/11, where they wrote a little short obituary of every single person who was killed on 9/11. Carla wrote some of those, if I'm remembering right.
Portraits of Grief.
Portraits of Grief.
Yeah. Look at these pictures here of some of the people you've written about, and just fascinating to see. I love reading obits. It feels a little macabre to talk about that, but there's something about obits that I like. Ron says, I love reading obits, especially the New York Times, because they give you the side story, as you were just saying, Neil. What is it about obits and people like me who love them so much?
I like them because having written a couple hundred of them by now, hundreds of them. I like them collectively as a sort of a testament to the variety of human life. Every story is, of course, different, and everyone's life journey is different, and it's endlessly fascinating to me how people started out and how they ended up, and the road that they traveled to get there. And it's most of the people we write up, we're writing up because they had a positive impact, of course, in some way or another. You could easily do just as many obituaries of people who had a negative impact. And in fact, I always thought we should do more of those. We wrote up Charles Manson when he died, of course. But it feels like, to me, the obituary page collectively, if you take the obituary book, we've published a couple of books of Times obituaries. If you take one of those books and read it cover to cover, you should get a sort of a snapshot of our times. There should be a little bit of everything. And I'm not sure we do enough negative obituaries, but then again, every time you write one of those, people complain that why are you memorializing this person who, whatever terrible thing that person did. Why are you memorializing this mass murderer?
You're right. I'm sure that's a question. I'm just as Neil Parekh is scrolling through these. I just want to stop there. I didn't know that one of the members of Kool and the Gang had died. The architect of the Witness Protection Program. I want to just go back and read all of this. Kathy Smith, who injected John Belushi with fatal drugs, dies at 73. Who sculpted Broadway? Howell Binkley, who sculpted Broadway hits in light. Dan Budnick, who photographed history. Like, we could have a whole show where we just read your obits of other of folks like this. There's so look who fought for disability rights, dying on the 30th anniversary year of the ADA. Ken Bernard, convention-shattering playwright. And this is just the ones we happen to be looking at right now. Specialist in eyes and coins. And Robert Ryland, who broke a tennis barrier. Exonerated in a murder case. It's like between the two commas is who this person is, right? Art world visionary. To be able to squeeze your entire life into 4 words. A physician full of fun. Oh, I want to read that. A versatile film director. Let's keep going. A star of Enter the Dragon, John Sachs. Oh my God, I loved Enter the Dragon as a kid, watching that Bruce Lee film. And he was the white guy in the Bruce Lee film. And I love that. Czech communist leader. So you have to find like 3-4 words. And then you did an Overlooked No More. Let's talk about the Overlooked series. Such an important. We talked a little bit about that with Amy Padnani when she was Obits editor. But talk about this, please.
It's a wonderful series, largely Amy's idea, as I understand it. Amy's one of the editors on our desk, on the Obituaries desk. And it's a series that tries to make up for the cultural imbalance that characterized the Obituaries page for decades and decades. If you had scrolled as you just did there, if you'd done that scroll, 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago, or 25 years ago, well, you would have seen a lot of obituaries of white men, and not many of women, any minority group, anyone from the disability world, any of those people. So Overlooked is an attempt to make up for that by writing obituaries that we should have written when the person actually died. So Cheryl Wade, who was a very outspoken disabilities advocate and someone who was disabled, was someone we didn't write when she died. I forget when that was, but so I wrote something on her.
Imagine not writing an obit of Ida B. Wells.
Right. So we're getting better at that, at making the page more diverse, consciously trying to do it. And
you go back to the years the times these existed, right? That's the point. You're not like going back to Shakespeare and other famous figures.
Right. It's basically a corrective. It's essentially an obituary we regret that we did not write when we could have written it instead of writing it now.
And newspapers, as part of, there's a lot of reckoning that's happening about race in this country. The LA Times wrote a very powerful self-inspection about its history of racism that was very, very powerful. And when journalists turn their eyes on themselves, they're able to bring powerful writing, reporting, and fact-finding about our own institutions, which have had our own share of issues. Nicole says, in Cyprus, small country where people live long, obit section is like sports pages or wedding announcements, but alarming because most use young photos instead of, I guess, photos later. I saw so many other great comments coming in. Here, Mark says, trying to remember the actor who said he read the obits to make sure he wasn't in it. That's a great line.
Pete Seeger had a song that had that same thought in it, talking about how he gets up every day and reads the obits, and if he's not in it, he goes back to bed.
And I wonder who got to write Pete's obit. Again, small world. Pete performed at Columbia J School graduation as a surprise because his grandson Kitama was in the audience as a graduating student, and so he was a grandpa coming to see graduation, and said, "Would you like a song?" He said, "Yes, please," and he performed. So that was amazing. Let's keep going.
Who wrote that one, and I wonder when it was written, because Pete Seeger, of course, lived forever.
And was famous forever, right?
He was probably written long ago. It may have been one of our. We've had obituaries that were written so long ago that the obituary writer has also died. So that you'll find those turn up occasionally, and there's a little editor's note at the bottom of them explaining that the person who's named in the byline died in 4 years ago, and this obit was written in advance. So we've had to deal with that a couple of times.
I'm sorry, can I just pause here? Joanna Cole, who imagined fantastical bus rides. She wrote Magic School Bus, which my kids loved. The TV show, the books. She passed away. This is like getting a news update now, many months later, that she's passed away. Michael Lewis, who forged a life after prison, died at 65.
Yeah, he was a COVID death.
Composer in a male-dominated era, Atomic Cafe co-director, defender of French culture, fought to correct Nelson, a military slight, distinctive singer in. So just all these great people who've left their mark on history, and that's what an obit does. We'll look at a couple more comments. Neil, when you were about obituary, does it affect you emotionally and personally? This is a heavy-duty subject. Are you also able to grieve, mourn? It must be so touching to be able to do this work.
It's touching, and it does affect you, and it's I've done all sorts of interviews in my career. I interviewed a lot of celebrities when I was working on the culture desk, but for an obit, you're often interviewing a family member to get the details of the person's life, and you're often interviewing them fairly soon after the person has died, and those conversations are always interesting and a little touching to me, because you might be the first outside person, the person not family member, who they've talked to since their loved one, whoever it was, passed away, and that I often find that they're it turned into sort of a confessional type of thing where they want to tell you everything about this person. You called them to get the person's middle name and their birth date, and they want to tell you everything they know and feel about the person. It's quite moving, and it's not it's the kind of listening that you should do in all your reporting, but that you often don't have time to do. If you're covering a hard news event, you're really just jumping in and grabbing something. But here, I always like to hear the family member out when I talk to them. Let them talk as long as they want. But yeah, it's emotional. It's emotional to write people like Jim Dwyer, I didn't write that obit, but it's always a little emotional to write somebody who is younger than you are, as Jim Dwyer was. But to me, what I found oddly has been the most kind of sobering and kind of make me sad pieces to write are and I've written a number of these now, where the person you're writing about died at like 102 or 103 years old, lived a very long life, so long a life that they outlived all their loved ones, they outlived all their friends, and so you're getting the information about them from people who didn't really know them. Maybe it's the executor who's closing out their will or whatever it is, and just the thought of these people living out their last years kind of with nobody left in their life, those are the ones that really kind of sadden me.
Can I just go back? Can I just pause? Just if you just go further down, Neil Parekh, I saw that Dr. Kawasaki died, and Dr. Kawasaki, the one of the conditions that is affecting children who have this heart inflammation. And there he is. It's called Kawasaki disease. And I didn't realize, and it was people dying of COVID, young children dying of COVID. I remember talking about it on my WBAI show. We had doctors on to talk specifically about this disease, and that he would die this year in the middle of the pandemic, where people were talking about the disease named after him is kind of an amazing coincidence.
Yeah,
And
I remember that one. I remember one of the first Lost obits I wrote for the Lost series, the pandemic victim series, was of a doctor in Africa who was instrumental in working on AIDS when that was sweeping Africa. So she was known for her work in one epidemic and then died in another one. So
you got to write an obit of a person who you said didn't, they're not all positive. You did one of one of the bombers of the Birmingham church.
That's right. I did him. I remember one of the early ones I did was this was a weird juxtaposition. It was somebody who had a hit record. It was a vocalist for a band, forget which band, Tower of Power, I think. And he served time in prison for a triple homicide. That was an odd juxtaposition of accomplishments, if you want to call them that. But,
yeah, I'll also point out one thing, that there's a family that I was trying to help them get a Wikipedia entry about their loved one. And one of the things that helped was that finally, when the Times did an obit, it was easy to write the Wikipedia entry.
Get the Wikipedia entry.
Yeah, and so so it really is something to be in the New York Times with an obituary. And we often will say about people that, at the president of Columbia University, who oversees the Pulitzer Prizes, will often make the joke at the Pulitzer ceremony that we now know what the first line of the obituaries of all of these people will say. So-and-so won a Pulitzer Prize. And here's Pete Seeger's obituary.
Who wrote that?
Let's go down and see who wrote that. He died at 94. And John.
Oh, Pirellis, of course.
And he died 6 years ago now. Wow. I remember him singing at Columbia J School, and just people were in tears watching him sing, in a surprise at that graduation ceremony. So many other comments coming in. We don't have time because we've got to get to the paper, Neil.
Did we publish a paper today? I forgot to check.
You did publish a paper today, so let's take a look at the paper and talk about the news. And I do also, folks, please tell your friends, because we're going to talk about Broadway, and Broadway being dark through June with Neil, and what that means, because Neil was former theater critic of the New York Times. So first, let me ask you, Neil, that when we met 4 years ago and you did the New York Times read along, both you and I may have been surprised to see the paper in full print, even these 4 years later, and how well it's doing, and as opposed to what the president calls the failing New York Times.
Yeah, it's for a failing enterprise, we certainly are doing quite well. And the print paper continues to be just a masterpiece of graphics and presentation. It's a wonder of the world. If it ever disappears, and if print papers in general ever disappear, geez, it'll just be a lost 100 years from now, and you try to describe to someone what a print newspaper was and why it was so great, you just won't be able to put it across to them.
This was all very odd back then. We didn't have StreamYard, which is the tool we're using now. I didn't have Neil Parekh and folks to help me. So we did this interview. You were on, I think, FaceTime, and I used my phone to point at my laptop This is from 4 years ago. I think, yeah. Were you in New Jersey at the time?
Yeah, that was probably in
and there's
Jersey.
the art section. Neil Parrick, let's just kind of scrub through this and see what we see with just a couple of images to see the time. Look at that. That's about voting. So this was the year of the big election in 2016. And I can see we had 128 comments and 3,000 people watched that conversation about the newspaper. And look at this. I see a comment from Steve Taylor, who is now part of our production team and works with us at Digimentors. And the playing around that I was doing with Facebook Live in those days has turned into a full-fledged business for me and my team at Digimentors. And so anyone who's watching who wants their own talk show or wants their own virtual event, we've done events for 50 people and 100,000 people. And just this past week, we did a 24-hour live stream. So Neil Genzlinger doesn't know this, but basically the start of the seeds of our company and the ability for us to work blessedly in this pandemic was that these kinds of episodes very early in our work together. And that's what you're seeing here. And I had more hair then.
So did I. That'll be in my obit then. He was one of the early guests on the read-along.
And look at that election. So 4 years later, that's what everyone's talking about, the election as well. So let's go to the paper and take a look at what's in the newspaper today. Lead story: swarming for favors in a swamp Trump built. Guests seeking access paid millions, taxes show. So this is the continued series from the big blockbuster the other day. So these are new stories that are coming, and look at the number of bylines on a single piece here. Let's go here. Fertile ground. QAnon thrives with Germans. Similarities to ancient anti-Semitic themes. QAnon is something I don't think enough of us, including me, had paid attention to, and we didn't raise the alarm early enough. And now we have at least one one candidate for Congress who's going to win in Georgia, and she is anti-Semitic, white supremacist, and she believes that there are congressmen and women who are a part of a Satanistic cabal. So how does that work? Why would you want to go into the system that you believe is filled with pedophiles and things like that? Absentee voting from Democrats far outpaces 2016. Turnout in key states. Patterns seem to show Republicans avoiding mail-in ballots. And this is the reason that Trump has gone specifically after mail-in ballots, because he has understood that if everyone votes, he loses. And that's what they're fighting here. And I made an observation in March and April that I didn't think the pandemic would last this long, but I made an observation that when the pandemic, if election happens during pandemic, Democrats who follow the science will stay home while Republicans will happily go out and vote. I was joking, but that's where we're headed, unfortunately, in some parts of this country. National divisions tear a hole in small towns' civil politics, and shoppers stream to curbside, transforming economics of retail. So almost everything here is about the pandemic and aspects of the pandemic and the national political scene. Neil, this seems a little surprising to me because on the front page, they often try to have, especially on Sunday, either some lighter fare or something not connected with, the breaking news type stories.
Yeah, in the old days, the old days being before the Trump era, that seemed like there was always something, a casual sort of read on the front page of Sunday. Is Whitey Ford's not on the front page, or was he yesterday?
I'm not sure. Whitey Ford might have been yesterday, maybe, because there's no pointer here either. So Whitey Ford, the great Yankee.
He must have been.
Yeah, must have been yesterday. I do have the front page of the Saturday paper here too. Look at this. $68 million stadium for football Giants is opened in New Jersey. This was in 1976, the debut of Giant Stadium. And it lasted only, 30, 40 years, because then MetLife, a new stadium at twice the size, opened at $1.6 billion. But $300 million in 1976 was a lot of money. And Neil Parekh, our Yankee fan, is posting and showing us the Whitey Ford obit. Beloved Yankees pitcher who confounded batters, dies at 91. An irrepressible son of New York City, Ford joined the pantheon of baseball legends who dominated the 1950s and 60s. And
scroll to the bottom of that, and it'll tell us where it was in the print paper. They got to put that on the front page, didn't they?
All the way at the bottom, it'll be there'll be an indicator. Let's see, and it tells you how long the obit is and how great his career was. And we're going, and we're still going. There he is. He used to come back for Old Timers Day, and there you go. So there are a couple of corrections, but here it is. Page A1 on Saturday.
Yesterday.
The final member of a dynasty dies. That was the headline in the paper. Tell me a minute, just for a second. We saw a correction there. Talk about corrections and the value of getting things right. People on Fox and other places love to say that the New York Times makes up things, but the New York Times takes facts so seriously that they correct sometimes what feels like ridiculous things, but each one is meaningful in its own way, isn't it?
It is, and the reversal I've seen just in my the length of my career. When we first started having an online paper, it was print edition would come out, and then we would put some version of the print edition online. But now it's completely reversed. We now go online, and then they extract a good print edition from the stuff that's online. And the difference that is made if you're an obit writer, especially, is that means a lot of the mistakes get wrung out of the stories. Not apparently in Whitey Ford's case, but a lot of the mistakes get wrung out before they make print because they've already been online and someone has noticed a mistake and pointed it out to you. And I will say that obit writing, before I was an obit writer, as you noted, I was a critic on the Culture Desk, reviewed plays, reviewed television, and so on. And change to writing an obit for me has been just really jarring. If you're a critic, you're writing your opinion about whether a play or a show was any good, and if you can manage to spell the actors' names right, you're okay. Correction wise, I had probably less than 10 corrections in 2,000 reviews when I was a critic. Writing obits is a whole different thing. They are very fact heavy. Every sentence is a fact, and therefore every sentence is a chance to make a mistake. And they're very heavily read and scrutinized, and a lot of the people reading them know more about the person you have written about than you do, or than you were able to learn in the 24 hours you spent working on this obit. So they are very quick to point out that no, he didn't grow up on Maple Street in Brooklyn. He grew up on Maple Avenue in Brooklyn, that kind of thing. And so it's every obit, as far as just sheer fact errors, is just a minefield of possible errors. So it's been difficult for me to relearn how to double check myself on every single sentence. And I still get a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed.
And by the way, Neil, some of those mistakes might be introduced by family members who are confused or don't have the facts themselves. So that can also happen. And I got to say, 10 in 2,000 obits, 2,000 pieces in reviews is pretty amazing. I have written 50 pieces or 45 pieces or so for the New York Times and have had at least a couple of corrections. So your batting average is much better than mine.
Well, it was then. It's not now. I would love to be able to get through a month without having a correction on one of my obits, but that's never going to happen because they're just too fact heavy. But yeah, sometimes you gotta you learn that sometimes the family itself doesn't have its facts straight. I had one the other day. I forget who the person was, but it had already been written by a number of sites, and I had written it that the guy died at 90, but then I'd gotten his birth date out of the family, and I noticed that he wasn't 90, he was 89. So I went back to the family, and they said, well, yeah, but he always wanted to be able to say that he lived to 90, so that's what we've been telling people, that he was 90. So everyone else who had already written this obit called him 90, but thankfully I was able to do the math. We called him 89, which is what it was.
So our dog Tara is saying hello.
Got neighborhood dog yapping in the background here.
I don't know. She saw something out the window, so that's what she was reacting to. By the way, Wayne Camadoy, your designer at the time, one of your great designers at the time, just commented. So I went and pulled out the Saturday edition of the New York Times, Whitey Ford on the front page, and he said it jumps to 9 columns inside. And I said, wow, that's a lot of columns. And in fact, look at this, 9 columns inside.
Wow.
What is this? What does that tell you when an obit runs like this? And how many times a year does somebody get an obit like this? Front page treatment plus what do you call this? A double truck? I forget. There's some names like that, right?
Not very often. That's Richard Nixon treatment right there. So that's got to be, I don't know what the word count of that obit was, probably 2,000 words anyway. So most obituaries, I usually write in the 800 to 1,000 word range when I'm writing daily obits, live obits, as it were. When I'm doing an advance, it's usually because the person's worthy of more words than that. So those an advance is 1,500 words usually. But yeah, that's a nice looking spread for Whitey. I don't know if they designed that in advance, or if we had advanced word that he was not well and had a chance to do a decent page for him, or if somebody did that live on the fly.
Here's the answer. Wayne says, designed in advance by Tim Oliver and Elena Gustinis. Oh, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing.
Oh, Elena Gustinis. Nice work there.
Here's a story for Johnson and maybe Trump. COVID as a metaphor is hard to shake. And when Johnson got when he was sick, he said he lost his elan and brio, as one analyst put it. The 3 world leaders who were the most skeptical of COVID, Trump, Johnson, and Bolsonaro, all got COVID. So what does that tell you? Let's keep going here. I don't want to draw you into political commentary as you are on the clock right now. So we'll keep going. CDC's directors is challenged to stand up to a bully. And a 6-student school is in just one home. This is how people are making do in the pandemic. I like that title, Family Interrupted. Women lead protests in Belarus, shattering stereotypes. Men's dominating role in society has collapsed, one activist says. And this is rare. A Nobel Prize ad in the New York Times. We see them for other prizes. I don't often see them for Nobels, but here a professor from Berkeley was named one of 2 winners in chemistry this year, and so she is being honored in the paper with an ad.
Nice.
New film touches on a taboo topic in Japan: World War II atrocities. And North Korea reveals what appears to be a new missile, and this is after Trump said that, while Trump was sending him love letters, and vice versa, he was building out his weapons program. And then again, failing New York Times to have, look at these ads: 1, 2, 3 pages, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh my God!
Olay has taken out that much advertising.
8 ads, 8 full-page ads, ending with Jennifer Hudson here. Have you ever seen anything like this?
Gosh, that's not lately. Boy, somebody dug deep into their advertising budget for that.
And this is my friend Reshma Saujani here. Look at that. That's her. Wonderful pioneering founder of Girls Who Code, mother, lawyer, Erica Joy Baker, engineer, advocate, disruptor, Jennifer Stone, actor, nurse, frontline hero, Amina Brown, poet, author, truth seeker, Joy Bolamwini, poet, advocate, AI researcher, Alyssa Carlson, astrobiologist, astronaut. That's a lot of work to put this and you said they dug deep into this. So you don't the publisher doesn't send out a memo saying, "Hey, folks, we sold a lot of ads this week," huh?
No, but good that we did.
Yeah, this is how you eat, isn't it? These ads it helps pay your bills.
The ads and now of course subscribers.
Yep. And here's that the commentary about the ragged right here. Janine says, awesome campaign by Olay. And let's see here, what else? Trump goes to a safe media space. It's cozy and perilously cloistered, but it may help him win. And talk a little bit about how graphics have changed the times.
They've I don't know if you're a fan of deep history, but of course, if you look at the New York Times from at the turn of the century, from the turn of the previous century, 100 years ago or earlier, it's just nothing but type. It's just nothing but dense gray type.
It used to look like this, wasn't it? Except for these photographs, it was like
except
this.
Without the photographs, right? And to go from that to the sort of visual cornucopia that it is now is it's just so much more reader friendly, and not just reader friendly, but there's information you can put across in a graphic more powerfully than you can put it across in words in a 1,000-word article. And the graphics folks at our paper are just really good at doing that, at finding ways to put across an impactful bit of information in an impactful way that registers quickly to the eye. I think of that fabulous graphic. What was it? I think it was unemployment numbers when they jumped to what I think that's what it was. That was just
they had the full
stunning.
They used the whole page, right? The length of the page to show the drop.
That was a brilliant piece of graphic work.
Carla says in some cases the graphics can get across information better than print. And look at this story here. Democrats facing confirmation battle, fear Feinstein isn't up to the task. She's 87 years old. And that's a huge battle is going to start tomorrow morning, even though three members of the Senate committee got COVID. Yeah, go ahead.
Somehow I'd not realized she was that old until I saw that article.
Yeah. Tell me about your interest in sports.
Well, the worst part about the semi-hurricane we had on the other night was that it did not knock out power here in Louisiana, where I am, and therefore we had to watch Game 5 of that Yankees playoff, and that was painful.
Let's keep going here. Let's look at the Times Magazine, the culture issue, and it's Bad Bunny's world now. The Puerto Rican reggaetonero has come to dominate global pop on his own terms, is the title of this cover in the magazine right now. Let me just bring the cover here so you can see it. And quite a stunning photograph here of a Puerto Rican musician and the culture issue. And after this, we'll talk about Broadway, folks. Neil, as you heard, wrote thousands of articles about Broadway and theater and all of that, and so we'll talk about
the theater piece in that issue of the magazine, that one that tracks the little theater group and how how it's COVID has affected that.
I haven't seen this yet, so we'll discover that together, and we'll see the design here as well. And since we're talking about ads, here's a ad for Dropbox, which you know is a fully digital business, and this is an ad in the magazine. But look at this, a separate section in the paper, a whole section for Dropbox in this kind of what do you call it, a fold out or something? Look at this. This is how there's an 8-page section, an ad in the New York Times. And some people may debate, was it better for Olay to do the insert the way they did, or would it have been better to have, now that there's a direct comparison to this this ad here as well, and then they spent money here too. So we're going to just see the video that the Times created for Behind the Cover, and let's listen in and watch. And it'll give you a second to catch your breath, Neil.
From the New York Times Magazine, this is Behind the Cover. This week is our annual culture issue, and the cover story is a profile of Puerto Rican reggaeton artist Bad Bunny, who exploded onto the music scene in 2016 when he was just 22 years old.
He directly engages with the politics and history of Puerto Rico in his music. So we wanted to work with Mara Corsino, a wonderful photographer based in Brooklyn who grew up in Puerto Rico.
Bad Bunny on set is inspiring. He kept moving and being himself, regardless if I was shooting or not.
Mara photographed him in the studio and on the streets of Santurce.
I believe the shoot confirmed how much the creative community in Puerto Rico is supportive of each other.
We knew pretty immediately that we wanted to use one of the studio shots for the cover. We were trying to decide between the wider shot where you could see Bad Bunny's clothes and his body language, and a really close-in shot of his face, which felt very graphic.
He just has so much warmth to it. There's a look in his eyes that draws you in, and then the symmetry of it is really quite wonderful.
Yeah, I think the mustache was a lot of it. It gives it so much personality and a focal point. We know for some of our readers, this will be an introduction to Bad Bunny. But for his legions of fans worldwide, they know him as an artist who's making music directly for our times.
And there's a cover that they chose, and that's what you see there. Did you know Bad Bunny's work?
I did not.
I only knew it because of my son, who loves this kind of music, and is my window into the world of pop culture when you have 17-year-olds. And we spend a lot of time in Puerto Rico. In fact, I'm going to take my first flight in 7 months to Puerto Rico this week. And so I'm looking forward to reading this piece here. A huge worldwide star, pop music. So the culture issue, one of the things that's confusing to us non-Times folks, Neil, is when they decide to do like a voyages issue, even though there's a travel section, and then they do culture issue, even though you have arts and culture and arts and leisure. How does that work? What's the coordination between the magazine and the news pages?
I'm not sure. It's a little above my pay grade, but there's the magazines. I think is essentially a different universe. At the Times, I know they do the year-end obituaries. People we've lost, and I think they may consult a little with Bill McDonald, the obituaries editor, when they choose who to put in that feature. But I think it's basically their decisions and their writers, and which is good because it makes for a different sort of presentation than a straight obituary. So, and that's always a widely anticipated issue, that end of the year issue for them. So as far as the culture issue, I don't know if they had back and forth with the culture desk where I used to work, or if they did their own hunting and choosing. Mm-hmm. but I would guess they tapped mostly outside writers for that. But not having seen the issue yet, since you can't, my daughter tells me she tried to get a print subscription to the Times here and was told that, that it couldn't be done. So I'm flying blind, as I haven't seen any of this paper yet.
Here is When Slavery is the Subject. Is it possible to make useful art about America's gravest sins? A meditation on the TV adaptation of James McBride's The Good Lord Bird. And in another coincidence, James is a graduate of Columbia Journalism School. We started by talking about Jim Dwyer and his passing. And this is a picture of Ethan Hawke. Many of us remember Ethan Hawke as a young man. And now you can see the lines on his face. And he is older now, as we all are.
Interviewed him for an obit recently of somebody he had worked with. I forget who. But a nice sounding fellow, and he was good. So often when you're writing an obituary, the of a cultural figure, people want to be the first to say that he was a great guy and a wonderful human being, or she was a great friend and someone I always admired. Some vague, meaningless comment like that. It's always hard to get a useful comment out of the celebrity world, because they're all trying to be that person who wants to say she was a great friend and a great actress, which doesn't tell you anything about them. But Ethan Hawke was good about delivering more specific comments. So was I wrote up Hal Binkley, who was a lighting designer, Broadway lighting designer, a couple of weeks ago, Tony Award winner, and he had designed the lighting for, among other shows, Hamilton. And Lin-Manuel Miranda gave me some good specific comments, and not vague stuff that he was a great man and a great friend. Good specific stuff about what made him a good lighting designer and the busiest lighting designer on Broadway. So it's always good to find somebody who gets it, who understands what you need for the obituary, and what you don't need is a lot of flowery, vague quotes, because if we use them, then every obit would be the same, and every obit headline would say Jane Doe, a great friend, dies, because that's what everyone tries to give you in their tweet caliber quote.
I want to show everyone this story in the Times Magazine, Seeing Black Futures. How can the current flourishing of Black culture be properly preserved? By Jenna Wortham and Kimberly Drew. One of the things I'm most proud of at my time as the Chief Digital Officer of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was hiring Kimberly Drew. She was somebody who had a bigger following on Instagram than almost anybody at the Met, and maybe the Met itself at some point. And she's gone on to have a great career. And this is an essay and portfolio adopted from Black Futures to be published in December by One World, an imprint of Random House. And so very proud of the success that Kimberly Drew has had. And Jenna Wortham, of course, a mainstay of the New York Times for several years now. And just look at the use of color and photographs here, very powerful stuff. The Last Laugh. The Trump years created a bumper crop of liberal comedy shows, almost all of which have been canceled. Why is the president so impervious to satire? What's your answer, Mr. Culture Expert?
I think it's because the humor is one universe and politics is another. I think one thing the 2016 election made clear was that that no matter how many monologues on the Daily Show or the Late Show or whatever are done satirizing Donald Trump, it doesn't have an impact in his universe. And if I were a comedian, I would be asking myself, what geez, I thought I was helping shape the culture, but it turns out I'm kind of irrelevant to the real world. So yeah, it's an odd phenomenon that Donald Trump can be lampooned endlessly for months and months at a time, and yet it doesn't seem to really change anything out in the real world. Makes for good television and maybe some good jokes if you're on the right side of the political spectrum, the correct side of the political spectrum, which for that humor is of course the left side, but doesn't really move the needle in any way.
Before we let you go, we've got to talk about Broadway and its closing. Here's a story. The show is halted and the struggles begin. Talk about what this means for New York, for the world, that Broadway, all the way down there, I'm looking out my window, is closed through June at least.
It's hard to wrap your head around that, especially if you've covered a lot of theater as I have, and you. Not only Broadway, which is one type of theater, but when I was reviewing theater, I was reviewing, off Broadway or more often off Broadway, and there's a whole universe of people, not just the actors and actresses, but everyone who works on that type of theater. God, I can't even imagine what has happened to all those folks. The old cliche about I'm an actor, but I'm working as a waiter. That's only a cliche because it's often true. And so those people, not only are they not working as an actor, they're not working as a waiter either for a lot of the preceding months. So I think of all those great small theater troupes that I reviewed, and it just makes me really sad to think that their whole world has been just completely knocked off the rails. I don't know what has happened to all those folks. I don't know how that industry recovers. I would think that, Broadway, you could maybe, I'm surprised they haven't tried to reopen with a socially distanced show with an absurdly high ticket price to cover the empty seats, because you could maybe pull that off on Broadway, where tends to draw an upscale crowd, and they can afford to pay $500 for a seat if they have to sit in a 2/3 empty house and watch a play. But all those little theaters that barely survive to begin with, geez.
Could one thing be that because the season would have ended in June or something like that? Is that why they're doing June? Or is there a season that way so that then maybe they'll just start a little later, or is there a summer quiet?
I guess. I don't know if they're pegging it to that or just kind of guessing, as we all are. But geez, I wouldn't want to own one of those theaters now. I wouldn't want to be an investor in any show that thought it was going to be opening on Broadway right about now. All those people have, I don't know what happened to their investments, and it's just depressing to think about if you're somebody who loved going to the theater, as I always did. And I always enjoyed writing those reviews in those 30-seat theaters that I would go to down in the Village or wherever, Lower East Side, and then seeing the actors that I reviewed a couple years later would turn up on Broadway or on television, and that was always a rewarding thing to know that you'd seen them early on and in their careers, and now it's that pipeline is kind of gone. So,
Neil, I want to just read you this article under the article about Broadway. Is you can open a business in pandemic in New York, and this is about Krispy Kreme opening. But look at this subhead here. We still want to dine out, eat carbs and cheese, buy lipstick and get high, if not in that order. That seems like something that wouldn't have run in the Times a decade ago as a subhead for a story.
Probably not, or would have been debated. There would have been a lot of hand wringing over whether can we say this, or can we not say this. But that's true. The Times is much more fun than it used to be, as far as little flashes of enjoyment like that subhead.
Well, one of the things I'd like to do is I have to go get ready for our show, She's on Call, where I sit in Neil Parekh's seat. And so what I'd like to do is to say thank you and then hand you over to Neil, because Neil Parekh, because we need to talk about Rett syndrome and to understand the important work that is being done. And if you want to share the story of Rett syndrome yourself, so we'd like to do that. But because we had the tribute to Jim Dwyer, we've sort of run out of our usual time. So we're going to extend the story a little bit, the show a little bit today. And Neil Parekh's so the two Neils are going to talk about Rett and just to close out the story. So I want to say to Neil Genzlinger, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure to have you here back. You're joining us from Louisiana, New Jersey, Louisiana. I hope you won't wait another 4 years to come back on this show and share your insights and also your good humor. I'm just very honored that you would be with us.
Well, I'm making my way across the country, I guess. Next time I'll have to do it from the West, find an excuse to do it from the West Coast for some reason.
Yeah, well, thank you again. And Neil Parekh, take it away. Thank you, as always. A great show. I learned a lot, and I think we did right by Jim Dwyer as much as we could in 20 minutes with Dan Barry and Jim Dwyer. Everyone, please go back and watch this episode. One point I will make, Neil Parekh certainly knows that I am against all male panels. This is sort of a coincidence of multiple things happening here. That's why we had, we had one of Dan's, Dan is one of friends of Jim here, and that's why we ended up not having any female guests on this particular show. But we try to do right whenever we can, have as much diversity as we can on our shows. Over to you, Neil, and the two Neils. Take it away.
Thank you, Shri. Neil, please.
The two Neils found out that they have now formed a support group, and here I'll give you your female guest for the day. We found out that we are both Neils who are parents of Emilys. Here's my Emily's over here. There's your female guest for the day.
So Neil, if you hold on 1 second, I have my own Emily I can bring on screen.
There you go.
So that's the one thing that we discovered yesterday. We're both Neil, so that's Neil Genzlinger, Emily. He works for the New York Times.
Ooh.
Hi,
and
Emily.
His daughter is named
I don't know.
Emily. And he's also a Yankee fan.
Isn't
that great?
And we both spell Neil the right way.
Yeah, so I need to let Emily go back. She's actually in the middle of a dance class. I didn't realize that. But Emily, thank you for saying hi. And we'll go back to our show. And Neil, thank you for showing us your Emily as well.
Bye.
The hazards of cameo appearances. But Neil, one of the things that I want to make a point to talk about, we had a chance to talk earlier. One of the things that we shared in the card, and this is the updated version of the card. So one of the things that we can do is make edits on the fly. Jim Dwyer was 63 when he passed away. But that you're, in addition to an obit writer and a former theater and TV critic, you're a Rett Syndrome parent. Can you tell us a little bit about Rett Syndrome? What does that mean? And just kind of share with our audience. Some folks are familiar with Rett Syndrome, some are not. Give us just a little bit of quick background, and I'll share this picture that we have of you and your daughter.
This is my other daughter.
3 pictures, your other daughters.
who's still asleep, who has a disability called Rett Syndrome, which is caused by a flaw in one particular gene. The gene was being discovered right about the time that Abby was getting diagnosed, which was 20 years ago now. It's 23 now. But you have what appears to be a healthy child until about the age of 2, and then she loses everything that a 2-year-old has acquired to that point. She loses her speech. Abby had mastered the word cat when her regression phase set in, so we heard her say cat a couple of times, and then we haven't heard anything from her in the 22 years since then. They lose a lot of their ability to control their muscles. They have apraxia, and so she can't use her hands very well. A lot of them lose the ability to walk. She has not lost that, thankfully. And cognitively, they kind of fall off the table in terms of any way we're able to measure cognitive function. So Abby's, she's bright and alert and engaged, but it's a little unclear what's going on in her head, and there's not a great way to communicate with her. So that's what Rett syndrome is, and it's a lot of other things go along with it, seizures and scoliosis. Abby has had corrective spinal surgery. She almost died during this surgery. This was years ago, but so this is Rett Syndrome Awareness Month. That's why we're talking about it. And there's a couple of good Rett organizations. You can find out more if you're interested. ReverseRett.org is one, and the Rett Syndrome Research Trust is, I think, what their real name.
I have RettSyndrome.org on the screen now.
Rett Syndrome is kind of the bigger of the two groups.
And then there's also this one, Reverse Rett, which is more focused on research, right? On looking for a cure.
Yeah, both of those groups founded by Rett mothers. That particular one, Monica Conrad's in Connecticut, created, and we've done a fundraising event for them in Hawley, Pennsylvania. I know you had a guest on from Hawley, Pennsylvania a few months ago. We did a fundraising concert there at my brother's, one of my brother's inns, and that was fun.
And you have a storytelling dinner coming up, right?
Storytelling dinner there on if you're in Hawley, Pennsylvania, on October 30th or 31st, you got to come to this storytelling dinner, which is a sort of a legendary event in that part of the world. They've been doing it for years and years, and the attraction is the carved pumpkins. They have a display of carved pumpkins that you would not believe. Carved by my brother and a bunch of his friends from the community. Some of them artists, and these aren't two triangle eyes and one crooked mouth pumpkins. These are artworks. I did the storytelling dinner a few years ago, and all the pumpkins they had carved with a newspaper theme. There were pumpkins carved with the New York Times logo and all kinds of stuff. It was fabulous. So I'm doing the storytelling.
Carla was sharing that she's had the pleasure of spending time with both of your daughters, both beautiful souls. And Janine said that a friend's daughter has Rett syndrome. She's involved with some of the support groups, so she's going to reach out to her and let her know about that. Deborah Bernick, who's here in Arlington, Virginia. Parents who are caretakers of young adults with disabilities are a special breed. Kudos to Neil for your empathy and activism. I know that from my work before joining Digimentors, I worked with United Way, and before that I worked with a union for long-term care workers in Washington State and home care workers. It's when you have a family member who has either a situation, a condition, a long-term injury, it becomes your life, and it becomes something that you organize yourself around. You've had the opportunity to write about Rett syndrome a few times, Neil. Can you tell us about that a little bit?
I've tried not to tap that well too much in my Times career, but I wrote a couple of pieces about Rett syndrome, or I've written a couple of pieces where I've mentioned that I have a child with a disability. One that got a lot of traffic was about there was a production on Broadway a few years ago of The Glass Menagerie, where the actress playing the female role, which in the play is described as having a slight limp. Well, she was, I forget what her disability was, muscular dystrophy maybe, or something like that. But she was much more disabled than people are used to seeing that character played, and it was causing quite a stir on Broadway. And so I wrote about that from my perspective as a parent of someone with a pretty serious disability. And the headline, I don't know who wrote this headline, but it was a fabulous headline. The headline on the piece was "Why This Wheelchair Matters," because she comes on stage crawling into her wheelchair at a very dramatic moment. So I wrote that. I wrote a piece on Metro that I was pretty proud of, that was not about my Rett experience, but was about a different family in New Jersey that has a Rett child.
That was this one, Our Towns in Sorrow.
That was that one. It was fairly sad story about this family had put in a pool for their Rett daughter because Rett girls seem to like the water. I think the buoyancy of the water relieves some of the stress on their muscles. They had put in a pool for their Rett daughter, and one of their other children drowned in the pool.
And it still gets you, and it just
still works me up, and the outpouring from their little town in New Jersey.
And Rett only affects girls.
It essentially only affects girls. We now know there are a few Rett boys out there as well, but it has to do with the fact that girls have two. Boys are XY, girls are XX. Is that right, Emily, or YY? I forget. But I think the gist of it is that they have one bad gene, one bad chromosome, but have another one that can cover for the bad one and allow them to survive, whereas boys have, if they get the flawed chromosome, they don't have anything to cover for it. I think that's the working theory. So it's essentially mostly all girls. There's one of the newscasters on NBC has a Rett son, who he's talked about fairly often, but you don't see many Rett boys. It's mostly girls.
Patricia was sharing that she could only imagine the adversity in dealing with this. Mark Lee shares that a friend of his has a son on the autism spectrum. And Therese Steiner, a close friend of ours, thank you for raising awareness and sharing your story as the father of a daughter with Rett syndrome. Very powerful. This is one of the things that we like to do when we can. The New York Times Read Along is at its foundation, at its core, a celebration of the New York Times, a celebration of print. When we get guests on the show, we want to talk about their work and their career, their endeavors. But I also would like to think that there's a certain aspect, if you talk about journalism, civic journalism approach, where when there's a cause, when there's an issue, we can use this platform to raise awareness about that. We can use this platform to educate people, whether it's as simple a story as voting, or politics. We've talked about about sexual assault, sexual abuse, and Denim Day, for example. Raising awareness for survivors of sexual assault. We've had Rosemary Aquilina, Judge Aquilina, who was on the case for the Michigan gymnasts. So this is, to me, this falls in that same spirit, Neil, and thank you for sharing that with us. We've been doing this for 5 years. As you know, you were on 4 years ago, and I actually remember listening. It was interesting for me looking at that footage of that show, because I actually hadn't seen it. I didn't visually see that interview. I listened to it while riding my bike. I was on a bike ride. This is before I was producing the show, working with Shri behind the scenes. So I actually was listening to it as I biked to Mount Vernon from here in Alexandria. So it was great to see that. Any last thoughts? And one of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about, Neil, and I would like to call out when we were talking about your work on the Obituaries desk. You had a long career at the Times before joining the Obits desk, and you talked about how it's a certain stage in your career when it makes sense to be on the Obits desk. Could you speak to that a little bit?
As I tell people, when I moved to the Obit desk, which was 3 years ago, I think I was 63 then, and I actually brought the average age of the desk down because it's a place that's inhabited by some of our older staff members, and I think that helps in that you are writing about the people who are dying now, and there's been a bit of an obit overload these days because all of the figures from the early civil rights era are passing away. All the figures from early television, the sitcoms that you might remember in the 60s, they're all passing away, and early computer era people, and so there's if you were alive during that period, you have some perspective, I think, that might be harder for a younger writer to appreciate, and so it helps from that respect. Although there's Bill, I know Bill McDonald, I think, has argued that it would be nice if every reporter at the Times did a rotation through the Obituaries desk, because it does, no matter how old you are, it teaches you a certain type of research and a certain type of writing that you don't get on your regular beat, but that is useful to you. So I'd love to see that idea explored a little more. But yeah, the Obit desk on the Times, or probably any other paper, is sort of a late career stop, because it's nice if you've lived through the years that you're mostly writing about, and mostly I'm writing about people who came to prominence in the the 60s to 70s.
Except for, and you made a reference to Amy Padnani being on the team in the Overlooked series. I mean, that changes the dynamic a little bit.
Amy, who is not in her 60s, she was in fact a classmate of my Emily at NYU, is a breath of fresh air on our desk, and helps us not just be old guys writing about people that we remember because we're old guys. Helps us, and also helps us internationally. We're trying to do more international obituaries since we now have an international audience, and helps us there because she's wicked smart, as we say in Maine, where I grew up. Amy is wicked smart, and
I just want to point out you're a Yankee fan, even though you grew up in Maine.
Yeah, and I went from being a Red Sox fan to a Yankee fan when Wade Boggs moved from Boston to New York.
You followed Wade Boggs. I'll take it. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference, the different kinds of obituaries that you'll write? Some of them are pre-written. You talked about the ones for Alec Guinness, for example, and you have them ready. The Whitey Ford one, of course, was designed. But you mostly write ones that are not breaking news, correct?
Right. I mostly write people who are not particularly household names, because those have all, unless the person dies unexpectedly and younger than you would expect, like a Robin Williams, for instance, anyone who's a household name that you can think of is already written. I think Bill says he's got about 2,000 advance obits.
Bill McDonald, the editor.
The editor. So, but even with 2,000 obits already written, every day there are literally dozens of candidates of possible people are brought to our attention one way or another that deserve a look, and not people you would particularly have heard of necessarily, but people who are worth taking a look at, and that's how I spend most of my days, is writing up people like that. People like Hal Dinkley, the lighting designer, who outside of the Broadway world would know that name, but the guy lit not every important Broadway show of the last 20 years, but a lot of them. And it's the kind of person you wouldn't know. It's the kind of job you wouldn't necessarily think about if you go to a Broadway show. You don't really think about the lighting, but the lighting, if it's done right, is an important part of creating a theatrical experience. And so that's why you write up a man like Hal Dinkley. So those are the kinds of figures I'm usually doing, and 9 out of 10 times, that's who I'm writing up. It's somebody you wouldn't have heard of, and somebody I usually haven't heard of either. Particularly, I might know the name vaguely, but it's more that I know whatever I'm writing them up for. I know the era. I know the universe. I know about the early civil rights era, if it's that kind of figure. I know about early television, if it's that kind of figure. So here I'm drinking from my New York Times mug.
Before we close, I know Patricia had a... Let me see the picture real quick. There we go. Vintage pinstripes. Absolutely. Patricia had a question of who picks the ones that you reflect on at the end of the year. How do you put that together?
Bill McDonald and the other editors choose those, which I think that they might have already posted that file for the year. And I don't know how they pick. They have a secret process that only they know, I guess. But presumably it's people who of the hundreds of obituaries we will write this year, it's the ones that kind of stood out above the crowd for their impact, or for the interesting nature of their life story, whatever that it might have been.
And I want to, just in case people joined us toward the end and was curious about what we were doing, we had a great show today. Neil Genzlinger was our guest, New York Times obituary writer, previously a New York Times theater and TV critic. We also talked about Rett Syndrome. We started the show off with Dan Barry, a New York Times columnist who paid tribute to a fellow columnist, Jim Dwyer. And so we went a little long today, and Shri had to get ready for She's on Call, which is airing at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. He executive produces that show, led by Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar and Dr. Marina Kurian. I'd also want to make sure that folks know at 9 o'clock tonight, Eastern Time, Shree's daily COVID call, the Positivity Show, Art Heals the World, with Grace Cho, Dilber Proc, and Christine Biancheria will be on his show this evening. So definitely encourage people to join. I would be remiss if I did not thank our sponsors for the New York Times Read Along. Jumping into the Jim Dwyer tribute really got us focused on that, and then the fascinating look at the Obits with Neil Genzlinger. So before I go back and say bye to Neil, I just want to take a moment to thank our two sponsors, Muck Rack. As you know, Muck Rack has a course, Fundamentals of Social Media, that Shree has set up. It's a course for journalists, PR pros, and everyone. It's a free on-demand certification course. In general, Muck Rack helps you discover news as it breaks, easily generate reports, and explore the work of journalists, podcasters, bloggers, and more. Muck Rack software helps PR teams build stronger relationships with the media. And if you're a journalist, you might also be eligible for their free tools to identify trends and showcase their work. In addition to Muck Rack, we also have Strategy Focus Group. Strategy Focus Group is a global team of human capital strategists committed to helping organizations solve people issues within your organization. They do that by working alongside you to solve your toughest problems and helping you capture your greatest opportunities. So for Muck Rack and Strategy Focus Group, thank you very much for your sponsorship. And if you're interested in being a sponsor, contact Shree at digimentors.group or myself, Neil at digimentors.group. And if you want to learn more about our sponsors, you can visit their websites. You go to readalong.link/muckrack and readalong.link/strategy-focus-group to learn more. And we certainly couldn't do what we do without their support. We'd also like to once again thank our team that pulls the Read Along together every week. We have a great production team: Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, Julia Weeks, and Carla Baranakis, at Big Green Pen, at Steve DeReeve, at Julia L. Weeks, and at Kabara. Mentioning Carla, tell us a little bit about this picture, Neil. What's going on here?
Carla and I are enjoying a not particularly successful betting day at the Monmouth racetrack in New Jersey. That must have been summer before last. Carla came down, and I often go there a couple times every year. It's not just me, of course. I go because that's something you can take Abby, my child with Rett Syndrome, to. A limited number of things you can take a child with a serious disability to. But the horse races are great because A, they're outside, and B, you're not bothering anybody, and so you'll see a wide array of humanity at the racetrack. And so Carla came down and went with us one day, and I don't think we won hardly a single bet that day. It was a nice day anyway.
And speaking of Carla, we also want to make reference to the Local Connection. The Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University brings you the Local Connection newsletter. Each week it offers story ideas and pro tips for journalists, and it's free. You can subscribe at bit.ly/local news tips. Neil, if Carla has not hit you up yet, I'm sure she's going to be asking you for a pro news tip for her newsletter fairly soon.
She did hit me up early on. I forget what tip I made up to
give. She did, good. Good. Well, thank you, Chitachi and Jonathan Borstein. And Carla was sharing that she and you were socially distanced before anyone had heard of
That's right, before it was
COVID.
fashionable.
COVID-19. So with that, Neil, thank you again for joining us for a great show. It's always fascinating to look behind the times, to look at the process, and to hear people talk about their work. So with that, we will let you get on with your day and let others, and we'll see you in the paper, I guess.
Okay, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you very much. Again, that was Neil Genzlinger, obit writer for the New York Times. And certainly as soon as we finish today's show, if you joined us late, you'll be able to go back to the very beginning and watch both the tribute to Jim Dwyer by Dan Barry and the review of Neil's obits in today's show. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.